Troy has a range degree from Utah State University, go Aggies, and he's going to talk to us about the Utah Grazing Improvement Program. He's employed with the Utah Department of Food and Agriculture. Troy?
Well, thanks. Glad to be here. Like he said, I'm from the Utah Department of Agriculture and Food. And we're going to talk today about using livestock to reduce fuel loads for prescribed grazing and for restoration. I'll have examples of each. So how can we use livestock to mitigate for fire, or can we? And my contention today will be that we can. Several ways. We can use targeted grazing to reduce fuels. We can use it to remove fine fuels, and we'll give examples of that. We can create fuel breaks with grazing. We've done that to good success in some areas and been able to stop active fires with fuel breaks that were done with grazing. And then we're able to do seedbed preparation by using grazing to perhaps plant green strips or other things that we want to do to create fuel breaks without having to use mechanical means. We can use the hoof action of the animals, them removing the vegetation, and it gives us opportunities that we wouldn't otherwise have. So perhaps we need more barbed wire fences for fire control. This is a picture. This is actually on the same fence. One's looking to the east and one's looking to the west. This was a fire that burned south of Beaver and Minersville a couple of years ago. And as you can see, it came to the fence and stopped for a long ways. So why? I mean, there was sagebrush. If you looked here, the community on this side was the same community as this side. But what this is a spring use allotment on this side and a fall use allotment on this side, and vice versa the other way. So in other words, before that fire season, the cattle were there, grazed that, took out the fine fuels, mostly cheatgrass, some crested weed and other introduced perennial grasses, but for the most part a cheatgrass system. And so the cows went in, removed the fine fuel, and in so doing protected that sagebrush component that's still there. So if you're looking for sagebrush or whatever, the grazing enabled that winter habitat for those grouse to remain intact. If they hadn't grazed this side, the whole thing would have burned. There would have been no reason for that fire to stop at a barbed wire fence. So, everybody else has had pictures of big iron and masticators and D9 dozers and different things. This is the tool that I'm going to talk about today. We got several different classes of livestock. They have different preferences, different abilities in what they can do. Brad yesterday was talking about how they can take a masticator, a bull hog, onto a slope of about 25%. Cows will typically graze slopes up to 30% and do that of their own volition. They can be forced onto slopes steeper than that. Cows, as we know and has been said, mainly eat grass. So the fine fuels component, they're not much browsers. They can be pushed to browse, but they prefer, and the majority of their diet is grass. What else? We got goats. These are kind of like the teenage boys of the animal world, if you will. You can put anything you want in front of them, and if they're hungry, they'll eat it. And they don't seem to have much gastric consequence. I mean, who else but teenage boys can eat a large pizza, 3 or 4 Pepsis, and then candy bars and cookies and never have ill effect? If you or I did it at our age, we'd be puking. But goats are kind of like that in the grazing world. They have the ability, and they're more browsers. They like browse type feeds, brush, trees. They'll eat anything that they can reach if you leave them there long enough. And I've even seen goats standing on top of stuff, including each other, so that they can get one more bite. So if you've got goats, you can go up to about 6 foot high. That's about what they can reach, depending on the species you got and how many you've got. So they're a different tool. They can go into a lot steeper country. Some downfalls with this that you don't have with cows is these are susceptible to predation. So if you're in a wild setting, you've got to do stuff to protect these. Cows are pretty self-protecting, other than the calves, but a mother cow's more than a coyote typically wants to mess with. Now, if you're in wolf country or grizzly country, it's a different story. But goats and sheep, the one we'll talk about next to, are susceptible to just about any predator. So moving on. Next one, sheep. Sheep are very similar to goats, about the same size. When we're figuring AUMs or animal unit months, it takes about 5 sheep or 5 goats to make 1 cow. So that gives you an idea of what amount of material they can remove. If you want to figure rough numbers, it's going to take 5 sheep to remove as much vegetation as 1 cow. So what are the costs? We've talked about aerating and chaining and what those things cost. What does it cost for animals to do your work for you? Well, the going rate that I've last heard for sheep and goats is somewhere between $1 and $2 a head a day. So you've got to look at the project you have and determine if that's cost effective for what you want to do. You've got to decide what species you're going to target as far as vegetative species that you're trying to remove and reduce fuels, and select the appropriate tool. It's just like writing a prescription for a fire or for a vegetative treatment of some kind. You're just using a different set of tools, a different suite of tools than what you have available in those other situations. So I want to talk some basics of grazing principles. And these aren't mine. This came with our program, with the Grazing Improvement Program. We got together the best range professionals in the state of Utah, and we locked them in a room, and we says, we want you to synthesize what are the important principles for grazing. And this is normally a 30-minute talk by itself. I'm going to condense it into 2 minutes here. And all of these people came together, including the agency folks. We had the state leads from NRCS, from BLM, from the Forest Service, and we came up with a set of principles. And those principles are, if this will go forward. Well, first of all, this is the question we asked. Why do we do grazing management? What's it for? And we want 3 things out of it, basically. We want to sustain land health and productivity. We want to demonstrate good land stewardship. And we want to ensure a future for livestock grazing. We want to keep grazing as a tool and as an economic activity in the rural West. This is an important way of life for many people, and it supports many of our rural communities. Those base dollars that they need come from these types of operations, from ranches out on the ground. So the principles, came up with 3 principles. They're pretty simple. The time, or how long you're there. When you go to graze somewhere, the one thing you control is how long the animals are in that location. How long is the vegetation exposed to those grazing animals? Why is that important? Because a plant, its job in life is to grow and set seed and reproduce itself. That's the whole sum of its existence. That's what it has to do. If a plant is grazed, it can recover from that and does recover from that, and it sends up new growth. But if after it sends up that new growth, it gets bit off again, it's only got so much energy reserves to try that again. So that is the definition of overgrazing, is rebiting that plant over and over before it has a chance to complete its life cycle. So we control that with the time that we're there. In an ideal situation in the growing season, a plant will initiate regrowth within 7 to 10 days after it's been bitten. So in a perfect world, if you can get your grazing periods shorter than 7 to 10 days, you will never overgraze that plant. Now, not all systems are set up where they can do that, but the more you can shorten those periods and stay there for a shorter period of time, the better chance your plant community will have to recover from that bout of grazing. So that's the first principle. Second principle is timing, or the season that you're there. We've talked about dormant season. We've talked about growing season. Plants respond differently when they're grazed in those different seasons. The important part of timing is to change that season. This becomes extraordinarily important when we're talking about fire control. The picture that I showed you with the barbed wire fence, if that hadn't have been spring grazed that year where that cheatgrass was actively growing, that whole set would have burned. But because the timing was right, at least on one side of the fence, that system remained intact. And we have that sagebrush component. Now we've got problems there. We've got a cheatgrass component that we've got to deal with at some point. Because if we don't, the 1 year we rest that, we get a lightning strike, we lose the whole shooting match. So there's still restoration that has to be done there. And livestock can play an important part in that. You know, they can reduce that fuel, and if we do it at the right time in enough years successively, in the spring we can take the energy reserves out of that cheatgrass and then perhaps give ourselves an opportunity to seed into that sagebrush. If we can get perennial species established, they can then hold out the cheatgrass from coming back in, and we can have a system that can hold itself together. So the last thing is intensity. And that deals everything with how much forage we remove. You know, there's a general rule of thumb that we learned in range management of take half, leave half. Okay, for regular grazing management, that's a pretty good rule of thumb. You won't get in too much trouble if you follow that rule of thumb. If you can be more conservative than that, you can get quicker recovery. If you go more than that, there's been studies, and those studies came out of the 50s and 60s that show once you remove more than 50% of the leaf material from a plant, it stops root growth. And if it stops root growth, it loses a bunch of its ability to recover. So that's important. However, if you're going after an invasive or an annual, you may want to prescribe an intensity that's much higher than 50%. But remember, if you do that, animal performance will suffer. And so you're going to have to do something to supplement or help those animals deal with that stressor that you're putting them under. I mean, a cow has to eat with her tongue. You can only get so short when you stick your tongue out to wrap it around the food that you're going to eat. A sheep has an ability, because of teeth, to go deeper, to go closer to the ground, to crop stuff closer. Same with horses, same with goats. So you need to be aware of the tool that you're using. You need to be aware of where the meristems are on the plant that you're trying to reduce. Or if you're just trying to thin something, you need to be very, very aware of that season and how much intensity that you take, so that you don't ding your perennial plants that you may be trying to stimulate. So it really is a prescriptive process. So another fence line contrast. This is in Box Elder County. And the point here that I want to make is that both sides of this fence are grazed. And they're grazed basically every year. What's different is the season of use when they're grazed. One of them's typically grazed in the fall. It's a gather pasture that they come into. So every year the grass gets a chance to go to seed, to go through its complete life cycle, and then it's used in the fall of the year. And then it has a chance the next spring to regrow. Conversely, the pasture on this side is used almost exclusively in the spring. It's a pasture that they use to calve in, or if not to calve in, to kick the cows into just after they've had a calf. And you can see that different grazing regime is causing a difference in the communities that are there. On this side, we have a lot more brush. We have browse species moving in. So as a manager, if I want to move to more brush, I can prescribe a grazing regime that'll give me that opportunity. I could do it on this side of the fence. I could start grazing here in the spring if I needed to, if increasing the brush component was my goal. But it's all about controlling those three things that we talked about: time, timing, and the intensity. How much we remove. Okay, so I think sometimes there's a perception that if we're going to use livestock to reduce fire, this is what the landscape's got to look like. This, just to clarify, is a feed row. You can actually see the alfalfa laid out on here. These cows are just calving. This is in March of the year. But the thing that I want to show you is I just told you that cows aren't browsers. However, if pushed and it's all that's available, look at this sagebrush. A couple years ago, before they were feeding here, this was healthy sagebrush. In fact, you can see this one that's on this side of the fence. That's what these all looked like before. But those cows had a good protein source. It made it to where the sagebrush was something novel and different to them, gave them the ability to ingest those terpenes and tannins that are in the sagebrush. And those cows have pretty effectively controlled that sagebrush right there. So an example of a species being used to do something different. Now that was just an unintended consequence. That wasn't something they were trying to do. That was the land they had and they were feeding their cows on it. Okay. So we've got a lot of cheatgrass in the West. These pictures are both taken in West Box Elder County. But you can see we've got stands where, this is basically cheatgrass and halogeton. You'd be hard pressed. You might be able to find a little bottlebrush squirrel tail, maybe an old plant or two of blue bunch, but you'd be hard pressed to find them in that situation. We still have an intact brush component in the background. Another picture is kind of same scenario. This is actually some brush that had been sprayed, but you can see the background where you've got literally thousands of acres of cheatgrass. And what's interesting is this cheatgrass phenomenon in this area is something that's happened in my lifetime. This country used to all be walk-through country for the cows. There was absolutely nothing for them to eat in the 70s. A cow would starve to death there. But since the 70s, cheatgrass has come in and infield. Now, another thing that you ought to know is that right through here was the sheep trail. It was the trail where the sheep, tens of thousands of them a year, went back and forth from Nevada, from the winter country, to the Soda Springs area. And so literally tens of thousands of sheep came through there every year. In addition to that, there's also about 5 miles east of here, a railhead at Kelton, where they shipped cattle. And so literally thousands of cattle came in, and you can imagine as they're coming in, they tried to separate themselves and hold themselves back. And so for 10 or 20 miles, you had an area that was severely impacted by grazing. And it was year after year. Those sheep came 2 times a year, every year. And those herders in that day weren't in a hurry. They were taking everything they could get on the way. And that sheep trail wasn't a half mile wide or even a mile wide. It was probably 5 or 6 miles wide as those guys spread out and tried to find a way to feed their sheep. So the perennial native bunch grasses, the forbs, there were some annual forbs and stuff left there, but most of that was gone. And we've had since the 70s a rapid increase in infill by cheatgrass, which makes it a fire-prone system now. The brush component, the browse component, is still there right now in places. But it's primed, as you can see with that kind of fuel load, to go up in smoke. So we have an opportunity, though, because this is cheatgrass. This was taken earlier this week. That's this year's cheatgrass. We had 5 or 6 inches of rain in May here, so we've got this year's cheatgrass that's this tall. That's the yellow stuff. We've had about 2.5 inches of rain in the past month, so we've got 6 or 8 inches of green coming up in that cheatgrass. That's an incredible food resource if I'm a livestock producer. I can put cows on that and they'll gain weight right now and do very well. But that's also on its way to being even more disastrous for fire, because we've got a big layer of thatch that we're going to have that's going to lay down when we get some snow on it. Plus we've got all of next year's crop of cheatgrass started. It's a winter annual, so it's going to come up. It'll stay green, kind of just stop growth during the winter, and then as soon as there's spring moisture and temperature, it'll jump, and we're on our way to having another crop of cheatgrass this tall. So you take 2 crops of cheatgrass and 1 spark when you get to July, and you've got a big potential for fire there. But if we jump on top of that, we can turn that problem into a commodity for our livestock producers. That's something that to them is valuable. They can put livestock on it and they can gain weight. So one more statement on range management. This comes from Stoddard, Smith, and Box. Proper grazing management schemes offer the range manager one of the most important tools in obtaining sustained productivity from rangelands. They must be properly designed and artfully applied to obtain the desired results. Moreover, and possibly more importantly, the rancher who adopts a grazing system is a more alert and observing manager. Now that's a big part of my job in what I do for the Department of Ag, is trying to teach these principles to ranchers and help them understand it. And I found that the most successful that I can be is when they adopt this and they start paying attention to the indicators. And they start thinking about time and timing and intensity. And they understand how those things affect their grass crop. And their grass crop affects their bottom line. What they want and what they need is to be able to stay in business long term. If they manage right, they can do that. So more on range management, art and science, more experience, we get better at the art part. I know more now, 20 years after I graduated, than I did when I came out of school. There's no substitute for experience and being in different places. I've had the opportunity to be all over the state of Utah, to see different systems, different environments, how they react to different grazing schemes. Some of that's the only way you can get is by being there. You can read about it, but until you see it on the ground, you don't understand it. So, and then range management is way more about people management, really, than it is about cow management. Cows or sheep, they are what they are. The tough part of managing, ask the managers in the room, is the people. And getting the people to understand the principles and apply them. So targeted grazing, how do we do it? We restrict animals to relatively small areas. It gives you maximum control. If you've ever been in a pen of sheep or cows, they'll do everything except what you want them to do. Kind of like kids in that manner. But if we confine them in a small enough area, we can control where and what and how long. So we can use them not only for fuels treatments, they've been used for weed control, and it's the most common grazing treatment for fuels, is this targeted grazing, where you are trying to make a fuel break or a fuel strip. So I want to talk about just a restoration project. This is actually a BLM fuels reduction project. Started about 10 years ago. They went in and did some mechanical treatments, some prescribed fire. Just kind of show you, these are the areas they were going to burn. You can see kind of the marks from the aerator and the disc where they dissed. They did some drilling. Some of it they just burned and left. Some of it they just dissed and left. Some of it they drilled. Some of it they aerated and seeded. Here you can see the same area in 2013. So this is after the fires have all happened. In fact, all the work was done in 04, 5, 6, and 7. And then basically what they got instead of what they wanted was a cheatgrass stand. Took out the brush with the fire and with the aerator and with the disc. Even where they drilled, they did get in the drill rows, there was some crested and some of the other stuff just kind of barely hanging on, but what they got was a sea of cheatgrass. And so what they did is in 2013 and 14, they decided that they would use cows to try to remedy that problem. They had a base, they went in and re-drilled parts of it, but they used the cows strategically in May and June. There was about 450 pairs. They had to use supplements, so they had crystal licks out there, brought the cows out and grazed it and got them off by about the 10th of June so that grass, the perennial grass, had a chance to make hay. Did that for 2 years, looked at doing it again this year, but evaluated it and decided it wasn't needed. Brad was involved with setting that up, Brad Jessup that talked yesterday. And the results are pretty amazing. They've got the forage kochia, which is the red you can see. You got crested, some Russian wild rye, a little bit of Snake River wheatgrass. But it went from what was this kind of community with straight cheatgrass to this kind of community. And they left some little islands of brush in there. They tried to leave about 30% of it. The only problem with those islands of brush is they're still cheatgrass. So I want to give Eric Thacker credit for these slides. These are his. This was some work that he's been involved with down at Camp Williams using fire breaks. They've used both sheep and cows. Targeted cattle grazing, it's on the south boundary. They've done it in the sagebrush areas to try to take the fine fuels out of it to stop that from burning. They've been using goats and sheep there in the oak brush and that kind of country since 2001. And you can kind of see the fall grazing with the cows. You get a fuel load if you don't graze it. If you do graze it, you take that fuels out, take the continuity out so that you have much less risk of a fire running through that community. You can see the fuel break. You can see the fire. The fire got to the fuel break where the goats had been and stopped. So another thing, we can use grazing animals to prepare seed beds, or we can use bulldozers and burn diesel fuel. Cost-benefit analysis. You got to decide which is best for you and your situation. About out of time, but we can use hoof action to prepare the seed bed. We want to look at large areas when we do it. How can we be strategic about it? How can we use them in a proper way? One area we looked at, and it's an area that keeps burning, is Skull Valley. So where could we strategically, using existing fences, existing water, set up places where we could put in fuel breaks, use the cows to create those fuel breaks, and then go in and seed either aerially with forage kochia or with drills or something if we wanted something else. And this was kind of our first idea. We're going to try a much smaller scale project. I think it's right in here. Is that about right, Ashley? So we're going to try it, see how it works. The plan is to graze it for 2 years, then spray with plateau if we need to, and then go in and seed it. So we'll let you know how that goes. But it's not something that you can do for free. There's a cost associated with that prescription. Just like there would be if you were going to go out with a disc or with a bulldozer or whatever. It costs to put that on the ground. These are some of the things you'd have to have. So again, I just want to reiterate, if you're going to push these animals, you can't use breeding animals. Your death loss, your abortion loss would be too great. You need to use animals that you can stand to not have gain weight, is what it amounts to. And the producer's probably going to have to be paid to make up that difference. So this is something you're going to contract, just like you would for a disc or a masticator. This is another tool in the toolbox that you can use. So, and like I said, you can then, after you've done it, use a helicopter or whatever, seed kochia. Usually the kochia seed comes off late. You put fresh seed on, you've got a better opportunity to have that seed grow and be effective. So,
We got time for questions.
Here it is.
So last winter we did a webinar series on seeding, and after a couple of the webinars in the Q&A, it came up that native seeds don't do well in some of our really certain sites, but there are a few species. The only one I can think of off the top of my head is lupin, that it's toxic to cattle.
Right.
So I'm wondering, is that always a non-starter, or is there ever, can cattle be trained to avoid species like that?
Well, if it's not prevalent in the landscape, they deal with lupin all the time. They'll eat a little bit of it, they get a negative feedback in their rumen, and then they move on to something else and kind of self-medicate. They can take some of it. If they eat very much of it, though, they have crooked-legged calves. That's the fallout for it. However, sheep and goats and other species can take that and use it. So you may want to look at what you want to use.
Troy, you showed us this great example of where you had the cheatgrass that grew really well this spring, and then we've got passion, and we got new cheatgrass. Now, a lot of times when you find those kinds of places, maybe it's in an allotment where the grazing plan doesn't allow for fall grazing, or it's it's on private ground where the producer, for whatever reason, doesn't have animals. Is there some kind of a program, a dating service, to get so we can get animals that need forage to the place that would need eaten?
Well, we've talked about different ways, and the way that I think would probably work best is do a programmatic NEPA for an area and identify that you're going to use these suite of things to reduce fuels. Not write it as a grazing action, write it as a fuels action, analyze it under the fuel shop, and then implement it. And then you can, if you've done overall NEPA, you can do CX, categorical exclusions, or determination of NEPA adequacy, and move that on the landscape. And I think long-term that may be a way to handle that.
Do you have any experience with doing any of this in focal areas of the sage-grouse community? We just signed that new plan, and we have to focus our grazing management in these focal areas, priority areas. Do you have any experience of working in sage-grouse habitat?
I do. Most of West Box Elder, where I've been the last 20 years, is in a focal area. In fact, it's SFA under the new.
Have you seen any pushback on targeted grazing? Because a lot of these sage-grouse, some of these pro-sage-grouse people are kind of anti-grazing.
Uh-huh.
Have you seen any pushback on targeted grazing with cattle?
Yeah, there is some. We haven't done a lot of targeted grazing yet, but I think there's some potential, and especially in those lower areas, those areas that already have cheatgrass, but we still have a sagebrush component. I think if we want to save that sagebrush so that these birds have a place for winter habitat, what better tool is there? You know, we've got to remove that fine fuel, or our sagebrush that those birds have got to have is at risk. If you lose a whole valley's worth of sagebrush that's winter brush, you've lost effectively that population, because they don't know where to go. Not that they couldn't, they're birds, they could fly, but they're not very smart birds from what I understand. So,
I think we got to wrap it up. There's a couple more questions. Hopefully you can catch Troy on the break.
okay, sounds good, thanks.